I grew up in a rural part of northern England, but moved to London 6 years ago to live with my partner as she had got a job there. I didn't drive at the time, so I would take the bus to and from work and walk a short way back to our flat. The walk from the bus stop to home never took longer than 10 minutes, and it was through a well-lit area lined with shops and restaurants. Up until this incident, I never really had any issues. It was November, so it was pretty much dark by the time I left work at 6 p.m. One Friday night, after I had only been living in London for a couple of months, one of my work colleagues asked if I wanted to go for a drink with her after work. I'm not a big drinker, but it was a Friday night, my partner was working late, and since I was fairly new in town and desperate to make friends, I agreed to go along for a couple. I took the bus with her straight from work to a pub close to her home. She lived basically the next suburb over from me, so it was fairly close, but not an area I was particularly familiar with. I had 2 or 3 drinks, so I was a little tipsy but not drunk, not that it should matter. I decided to leave at around 10 p.m. so as not to be traveling home too late at night, particularly along a route I didn't know. I said my goodbyes and left my colleague and her friends at the pub. On my way out, I stopped to put my empty glass down on the bar. As I did so, I looked down the bar and made brief eye contact with a man sitting a little further down. I gave a passing smile, as you might do when you make accidental eye contact with a stranger, and then continued on my way out of the pub. The bus stop was maybe 200 yards down, and across the street from the pub, you could see it from the entrance. I was about halfway to the stop when I got that prickling feeling on the back of my neck, like you get when someone is staring at you through a window or across a busy street. I turned to look behind me quickly, and it didn't take me long to figure out what was giving me that feeling. It was the man I had glimpsed back at the pub, walking about 20 paces behind me, watching me carefully. I was a little weirded out, but I reasoned with myself that it was a Friday night in London. There were a lot of people on the street, people heading home, people on nights out, people just milling around. So I put it down as perfectly innocent and just kept walking, trying hard not to look back. I reached the stop, and fortunately the bus was only a few minutes away. The man reached the stop only moments later and proceeded to hover a few feet away from me. I was on my phone and trying not to look at him, but I could feel his eyes on me. I looked up and caught him staring at me, expecting him to look away awkwardly as soon as he realized he had been caught looking, but he didn't. He just kept on staring. This was the first time I had got a proper look at him. He was a young man, couldn't have been much older than myself. I was in my early 20s at the time. Quite slender and tall, with short shaved hair. He would have been good looking if not for the intensity of his staring. I must have been looking at him for longer than I thought, because he then gave me a sly wink, and I quickly looked away. It wasn't a nice kind of wink, the kind that might be considered cute or endearing. No, this was an unsmiling, almost threatening kind of wink. The kind that told me he was watching me, that he knew I knew that he was watching me, and that he didn't care. My bus eventually rolled up, and I got on quietly, hoping that he wasn't getting the same bus as me. I wasn't so afraid at this point, just uneasy. It isn't nice being intensely stared at by anyone, much less a complete stranger. But I was still under the assumption at this point that it was just some creepy dude who happened to be at the same bus stop as me. Nothing more than that. I sat down on the lower deck close to the driver, and my heart sank a little to see the man get on just behind me. Fortunately, there was already someone sitting in the seat next to mine, so he had to sit across the aisle. But still, he stared at me now with a strange little smirk on his lips that made me feel even more uncomfortable. I did my best to pretend that I simply hadn't noticed him, only allowing myself the occasional glance up at him to see if he was still watching me. From what I could tell, he didn't look away once. With each passing minute, I was becoming more and more afraid, despite my best efforts to convince myself that this was all just an innocent misunderstanding on my part. At every stop, I was praying for him to get off, for this to be his stop, so I could relax and prove to myself I was just being paranoid. As the stops passed, I knew I was going to have to get off the bus soon, and I was fairly sure at this point that he was going to follow me. We were coming close to my usual stop when the bus took an unexpected turn onto a housing estate. I was so distracted by this guy staring at me and potentially following me, I had completely forgotten this was a different bus route to my usual one. In a normal situation, this would not have bothered me, but in my current situation, it was the absolute worst possible thing that could have happened. I was no longer on the well-lit street full of shops in an area I knew quite well. Now I was on a dark, quiet, completely unfamiliar estate. No people around, just rows of silent houses with the lights off. I realized I didn't actually know the route home from here either. I knew I had to be close, but having only lived in the area for a couple of months, I hadn't had the chance to get to grips with all the shortcuts yet. I waited until the very last minute to ring the bell for the next stop, and I jumped off very quickly. It was a long shot, but I hoped that the weird guy would be caught off guard and not get the chance to follow me. Suffice to say, that plan didn't work. In hindsight, I should have just stayed on the bus until it reaches the terminal and then maybe reported my concern to the driver. But at the time, I was a bit tipsy and scared and just wanted to go home. It was a dumb spur-of-the-moment decision made out of panic. He hopped casually off the bus after me, and at this point, there was absolutely no doubt in my mind that he was following me. I decided to stay at the bus stop and to call someone to come and help me. But all my friends and family that I would usually call in a bad situation lived back home hundreds of miles away. My partner was working nights and wasn't even allowed to have her phone on her person. I tried calling the girl who I had been out to the pub with to see if I could maybe double back to hers and stay at her house for the night. She wasn't answering her phone. I could call the police. But what if it turned out he wasn't following me? What if he realized I had called the police and attacked me? All the time, I was desperately trying to get in touch with someone who might be able to help me in my current predicament. This guy was leaning casually against the bus stop, hands in pockets, just watching me. Several minutes passed, and I still had no better plan in mind than to just stay where I was. I certainly didn't want this guy knowing where I lived. These thoughts were all rushing through my mind at about 100 miles per hour, and I damn near crapped myself when suddenly he asked for my name. I could do nothing but stare at him in surprise for a second or two. Then I forced myself to reply, "Amy." I figured I didn't want to piss him off at all, so I just answered with whatever name came into my head first. That horrible little smirk slid across his lips again. He was still leaning against the stop. "Give me your number, Amy," he said, and he took out his phone. This didn't sound like a request. There was a sharpness to his voice which made me shudder. "No, thank you," I replied. His face dropped. The smirk disappeared, then reappeared as he seemed to compose himself. "Where do you live?" "I'll walk with you," he said a little more assertively this time. "I'm staying at a friend's. He's actually coming to get me right now to take me back to his place." Desperate to come up with anything that would make him go away. He paused for a while, and I could practically hear the cogs turning as he tried to figure out whether I was lying. He watched me silently for a long moment, studying my face with a cold calculation. He must have decided that I was lying to him because he suddenly took a step towards me, and through slightly gritted teeth, as if I was really trying his patience, he repeated, "Give me your number." Startled at the sudden move towards me, I took several steps back. He continued to approach me. I panicked, turned, and tried to walk away from him, but he reached out and grabbed me by the wrist. I spun back round to face him, and now the only look on his face was one of complete anger. Fear had surged through me when he grabbed my arm, and his touch seemed to burn my skin like an open flame. It was repulsive, so much so that my body had an almost convulsive reaction to being touched by him. I managed to twist my arm out of his grip, and I heard a voice in the back of my mind telling me to run, and I did run. I turned and ran as fast as my legs would carry me, back the way the bus had brought me. I didn't even fully know where I was going, but I knew I had to get myself as far away from this person as possible. I made the mistake of looking over my shoulder once to see him now running after me, only a few feet behind. His eyes were wide and angry. The fear and adrenaline kept me going longer and faster than I'd probably ever run before. Just as I reached the end of the road, I saw what I needed, and I instantly burst into tears of relief. 2 police officers were walking towards me along the other side of the street. I made a beeline for them, now also yelling for help. By the time I reached them, I was a sobbing, breathless mess. I could hardly speak to tell them what had happened. I managed to splutter a few choice words and turned to point towards my pursuer. By now, he was almost back at the other end of the street. He had simply turned around and walked calmly back towards the bus stop, like he was out for a nice evening stroll. I was worried the police officers were just going to think I was some crazy drunk girl. But they could see I was clearly very shaken, and one of them ran off after the guy. The man had by now disappeared around the corner at the other end of the street, followed shortly after by the police officer, and that was the last I saw of him. The officer who went after the guy radioed his partner a few minutes later to say he had lost him once they reached the main street, but he would keep looking. The officer who had stayed with me took a description from me, and I made a report about what had happened. I told the officer I didn't fully know my way home from where I was, so she walked with me back to my front door. I was shaking the whole way. When I got into my room, I lay in bed crying until I fell asleep. I never heard anything else about it after that. There is no doubt in my mind that if he had caught me that night, he would have harmed me. I believe he was out looking for someone to target. I believe he clocked me the moment we made eye contact in the pub. If given the chance, he would have followed me all the way back to my front door, in the hope that I would at some point be alone in a secluded enough area for him to grab me. Everything about his demeanor and the way he spoke to me just screamed that this was a man who was just predatory. And the way he was able to go from being furiously angry enough to chase me down the street to immediately regaining his composure and walking away like nothing had happened in order to evade being caught is just absolutely terrifying. I'll remember his face for a very long time, and I would not be surprised if it comes up on the news at some point in the future. I worked at a popular theme park for several years while also going to college and working 2 other jobs at the same time. I seemed to get sick a lot during this period of my life. In hindsight, I now realize that it was likely due to not sleeping much, eating much, drinking much water, and being exposed to hundreds of people on a daily basis. On a busy weekend, I picked up a late shift to make a little extra holiday pay. I had been assigned to an area with a lot of guest flow, and the 3 to 4 of us running that spot were getting overwhelmed rather quickly. At some point, while trying to tell a guest he couldn't stay where he had parked his family, the guest got confrontational. I had been assaulted by parkgoers before while working, so I completely froze up. This guest was in my face screaming about how I was ruining his vacation when I saw a shadow appear from behind me. A very large man in a similar uniform to mine was standing behind me, staring down the belligerent guest. Behind him was another large man wearing the same uniform, telling the guest that he needed to move on or they would call security. I was so relieved. The guest left, and the 2 men stayed near me the rest of the evening to make sure I wasn't bothered again. The second coworker, Mac, asked me all kinds of questions about my life and where I usually worked. I was so grateful for their support. I think I answered his questions for the next 2 to 3 hours while we finished up our shifts. At the end of the evening, Mac asked for my phone number, and I gave it to him. He wasn't really my type, but I figured it was the least I could do after how much he and his friend had helped me. We ended up going on a date about a week later. It wasn't a very long date, and I realized pretty early on that I still really wasn't interested in him as anything more than friends. When we went to part ways, Mac asked when he could see me again. I tried to gently turn him down as nicely as possible, telling him I would be up for being friends, but nothing else. He protested, begging for one more date, and I could tell that he was pretty angry. I shook my head again, apologizing profusely, not wanting to be rude. His face was flushed with anger by now, and he forced a too long hug on me before I could walk away. It was a big theme park, and we didn't normally work in the same area, so I left feeling some relief at knowing I probably wouldn't see him again. My phone started going off constantly. Text after text paragraphs asking for another chance, telling me that we were meant to be and that our meeting had been fate. He really did think that he was my knight in shining armor and could not seem to understand why I wasn't interested. After countless messages back telling him I really didn't see him that way, I finally blocked his number. About a week later, one of my zone coworkers came up to me asking if I was dating a manager in another area. Mac had evidently been telling people that he and I were going steady. I vehemently denied it to my coworker and to several others that came up to me throughout the day. A few days later, I saw him waiting near the entrance to the payroll office, seemingly looking for someone. Before I could think to avoid him, he spotted me and ran up to say hello. I remember his eyes being too wide, smile just a little off-putting. He repeatedly said how much he had enjoyed our date, that he couldn't wait for the next one. There were lots of people walking around nearby, so I mumbled that I still wanted to just be friends and pretended that someone walking by was my roommate. Told him I had to go so I could get a ride home. his face contorted with anger again, and he tried to grab my arm, saying he would give me a lift home, but I dodged. Before he could try again, I slipped into the crowd. I remember feeling my heart banging against my chest and kept checking behind me the entire walk to the parking lot. He just stood outside the payroll office, his face red, staring at me as I walked away. A few days later, I was sick again. I got on antibiotics, but my body had, unknown to me, developed an immunity to that brand of medication. I kept taking those pills for a week, not understanding why I was just getting worse. My roommate finally came home from work one afternoon to find me literally gasping for air from my bed. She rushed me to the ER, where they admitted me for a high fever and pneumonia. That first night after being admitted, one of my lungs collapsed. The hospital told me that I was going to be there for a while. My roommate only told a few of our close friends that I was in the hospital. They visited when they could, bringing me books to read and keeping me updated on work. One told me that a manager from another zone had been stopping by almost daily to see if I was there. I felt my blood run cold and my heart rate ticked up on the monitor by my bed. I tried to sleep while I could after they left, but between the machines, the nurses checking in every hour, and worrying over Mac seeking me out, I could only manage hazy naps. The next day, I was woken up from one of these sporadic naps by a knock at the door. Except for a nurse, I tried to sit up completely, but didn't have the energy. Through sleepy, blurred vision, I saw a large man enter the room. It was a Mac. I felt my heart start pounding again. He was carrying flowers and had that creepy smile on his face again. I was literally stuck, couldn't move to get away, and no one was around. The nurse call button on my bedside was broken. The nurse had already warned me about it, saying they would just be monitoring my vitals from the desk closely until it could be fixed. I could not believe that he was here. How did he even find out that I was here? He came and sat next to the bed, grabbing my hand in a too tight grip. He told me that he was worried after not seeing me at work anymore, that he wanted to check on his girl. The heart rate monitor was beeping pretty steadily now and must have triggered something at the nurse's station. I still couldn't breathe very well. Long-winded speech was hard, and I was internally freaking out, so I was just replying to his chattering and questions with quiet single-syllable words. After what felt like an eternity, but must have only been a few minutes, a nurse walked in. Mac's grip on my hand grew even tighter, prompting something akin to a squeak from me as my hand felt crushed in his. The nurse must have seen the look on my face, and after a split-second glance between Mac and I, she asked him to step out so she could check me over. He dropped the flowers on the table and grudgingly walked out of the room. Before the door shut, he looked back at me and said he'd come back as soon as she was done. When the door closed, the nurse asked if I was okay. I shook my head no. She asked if I wanted him to come back. I said no. She didn't pry, but told me that she would take care of it. Grabbing a quarantine sign out of a cabinet near the entrance to my room, she hung it on the outside of my door. I heard him arguing with her for 5 to 10 minutes before it finally got quiet again. She told me afterwards that he had finally left and that she made a note at the nurse's station not to let him in again. I thanked her and asked if she could throw the flowers away outside the room. Just looking at them was giving me the creeps. I was there for another 2 weeks. They didn't want to release me too early, given my medical history. I asked my roommate to pick up a gift card the day before I left, so I could give it to the nurse who had been so kind and perceptive during my stay. I didn't return to work for another 3 weeks after that. My lung capacity took another month to fully be back to what it was before. When I got back, I asked a couple friends of mine if they had told Mac that I was hospitalized and where I was hospitalized. There were several large medical centers in the area. I didn't think he could have found out by calling every single department. They said they had only told our head manager that I was there when she asked why I'd been gone for so long. I now assumed that he found out from her. I spent the next several months looking over my shoulder and scanning rooms before entering. I thought I spotted him sitting in his car in our lot a few times, but was never 100% sure. I made sure I was never alone going out to my car in the evenings. I eventually found out that he'd been forced transferred to another park for reasons no one was told. I hadn't said anything to HR, so my best guess was something other than his apparent interest in me. I never saw him again. I work in food service front of house, so in the early days of the pandemic, with restaurants closed, I was taking work wherever I could find it. An old friend clued me into a medical office that needed someone to come in and do a bit of light filing. I was able to go in at night to limit direct contact with people, so I jumped at the opportunity right away. I wanted to avoid the bus if I could due to crowds, so decided to swing for a rideshare app. It's not all that expensive in my area, and I really didn't want a virus. I headed in at almost 3 a.m. because it was after the cleaning crew had left. I was kicking myself for being so cautious though, because I was exhausted. I stumbled onto the block looking for my ride, and to my tired self's great relief, the car spotted me almost immediately and pulled up asking, "Uber?" While I cluelessly wandered up and down the street searching, the ride was taking a while, but I'd only just moved here last year, so I'm not familiar with all of the surrounding areas and thought nothing of it. I was pretty alert at first, so I was trying to pass the time, playing games on my phone and stuff. But the car didn't have a compatible phone charger, and I wasn't sure the building would have one, so I wanted to save my battery to be able to call a ride back. I shut my phone down into airplane mode and eventually drifted off from a combination of tiredness and boredom. I don't often take rideshare, so being alone with a strange driver often put me a bit on edge, but this guy had a pretty boring car and a very standard look about him. He looked a little like my brother even. Young Clean kept listening to jazz. When we arrived, the driver tried to wake me up by calling to me from the front, but I was in too deep of a sleep and couldn't fully distinguish it from my dream. Finally, he awkwardly jimmied my leg to wake me up and kept saying, "We're here now." I was embarrassed that I'd gotten that out of it, so I just hurried out of the car and into the building. As I looked around, I began to realize nothing was what I had expected of an office park. I had seen a street view of the building when I first looked up the business, and it had appeared to be a strip mall plaza. The further I went, the more loudly alarm bells were ringing in my gut. The structure was semi-dilapidated, and it was pitch black, dark past the entryway. I expected some lights to be off in the nighttime, but not to the whole building. I skittered across the concrete foundation comprising what was left of the lobby area, told myself they must just be renovating, and followed signs for the stairs. After what felt like ages, but was likely just a few minutes, all I had passed was construction equipment, a couple locked doors, and some smashed windows. I was certain I was not going to find a medical office, and figured maybe I had mixed up the address. I took out my phone to double check, but once I got it out of airplane mode, I could barely get a signal. I kept moving around in the building, pacing looking for a stronger signal. I eventually confirmed in my texts that I had written down the correct address, just by scrolling back, which didn't require service. Since I had only been inside for a few minutes at most, I figured I should try and get in touch with the driver, because if I entered the correct address, then it was only fair he should continue my ride to the correct place and save me the added fees of calling a second trip, considering this was all his mix-up. The app was taking forever to load with my slow service, but before I could get to a cloud of reception, I heard a rustling sound in the lower level of the building. I was on the top floor, and the only stairwell I was aware of was the one I had taken up, so it would force me into the middle of the building. There was no way to exit the situation without encountering whoever was downstairs. In an abandoned building in the latest hours of the night, I figured the chances were high that it was a tweaker, and I had no desire to try slipping past a tweaker, especially when it was late enough that they were probably on something so jumpy and on edge. I tried to get a text out to a group of friends with my address and a request to call 911 to help get me from the property, because I didn't feel safe walking in that neighborhood at night and didn't have enough reception to call a new ride, but the message wasn't sent. Reception was too weak. So I gave up on getting my phone going and started checking for another stairwell or even a window with balconies or dumpsters that could be used to exit the second floor as a last resort in the event whoever was downstairs came upstairs. I scrambled over to a door with a stairs sign on it, but the stairs were completely dilapidated and it was essentially just a straight drop down to the first floor. At that point, the worst case scenario began to unfold. I heard whoever was downstairs begin making their way up the stairs. I thought fast and figured based on my walk about the floor was basically a giant loop, so I would have to wait for whoever this was to come up the stairs, wait for them to come all the way up, and then sprint the opposite direction of wherever they were going, and try to get down the stairs and out of the building in time to make it to the road without encountering them. I was not anticipating being chased or anything, but didn't want to piss off a druggie or have a homeless person who might be living there. feel as though I'd trespassed and become hostile towards me, or have any sort of interaction that could possibly occur at that hour in an abandoned industrial park. I held my breath for what felt like 5 minutes, but was likely closer to just 30 seconds, and the person appeared at the top of the stairs. To my great relief, it was just the Uber driver. I figured he had come back for me, realizing he had left me in the wrong spot, a place that could have worked out to be dangerous. So I came out from the beam I was hidden behind and started to wave him down. But then I processed. There was no way for him to realize this had been the wrong address. My stomach lurched forward and my blood chilled to slush. I made eye contact with him very briefly, and he was completely calm and composed, but breathing pretty heavily and blocking the stairwell down. On a normal, rational day, as an outside observer, I could think of a dozen innocent reasons he might have returned. But in the moment, standing across from him, I just knew in my gut that this was someone with ill intent. I can't remember much more from the ensuing few minutes. Operating solely on muscle memory and instinct, I Superman dove for the second stairwell's opening and just let myself fall down the drop. Thankfully, I don't think he'd seen where I'd gone at first, and though I was in too much pain to know it, then plenty was bruised, but nothing was completely broken. I scrambled up and threw myself at anything that seemed like it could be the door. It was too dark to tell. I was disoriented from the fall, and I wasn't in a calm enough mindset to think to use my phone flashlight. Plus, in hindsight, some part of me probably knew it would call too much attention to my location. Just before I was able to reach the door, it flew open with a blinding light beaming straight into my eyes. My first thought, though, not totally coherent, and I stumbled backwards trying to find something to hide behind. Before I could, a voice called out, "This is the police. Get on your knees with your hands behind your head." I didn't believe it was the police at first. I was in such a panic, and I continued looking for ways to get out. But he kept shining the flashlight right at me as I teetered around and yelled, "On the ground right now!" He approached me and finally shined the light away from me. It took a second to get my night vision, but once I did, I could see he was really a police officer. I tried to explain what was happening, but first he started asking me all these questions. And that, combined with what had just happened and my fear of the driver coming back, all snowballed into my being unable to form a single articulate sentence. He directed me out to his car, and once I was safely out of the building, I was able to start getting my bearings just a little. I sat on the edge of the back seat of the squad car with the door open facing out, while he stood across from me and asked questions. Nobody called him, but he was patrolling the area and noticed a car idling outside of this building that's known to be condemned, and nobody's supposed to be inside. He was launching into a speech about how if I'd gone to shoot up, he had resources he could direct me to, and that this was not an ideal place to do either of those things, and asking if I had somewhere safe to stay that night. But I was stuck on something else he'd said. Finally, it all clicked. The car, I spilled my whole rideshare story in a frantic word vomit. He looked around and the car wasn't there anymore. The officer guessed the guy had driven off while we were talking inside the building. He asked me all the details I remembered, and I told him, but there weren't many. I'd been too tired when the ride started to track much. But the officer realized I could pull up my Uber app and get all the information. There wasn't really enough reception there even outdoors, so we sped down the road, and once I had enough bars, the app roared to life and I had 4 missed notifications from Uber asking if I was ready to be picked up yet.